Session, I'm going to go through some basic functions in GIMP, some simple image edits that you can make. I'm going to start off with cropping an image, and to do that we're going to be using the crop tool that I covered in the previous section. Now you might be curious as to why you need to crop an image in GIMP when it is in fact possible to crop images in Microsoft Word and other Microsoft Office applications. The reason that I'm going to cover cropping in this is that when you crop an image in a Microsoft Word application, the application actually saves the surrounding image data. So when you crop an image, it doesn't delete the rest of the image that gets cropped away. It actually saves that. Now this is obviously quite useful because it means if you ever have to go back and show the original image, you can do so. But 9 times out of 10, once an image is cropped, you don't necessarily have to go back and show what was the image in the way it was before it was cropped. And so what happens is that you have all this extra image data that's floating in the document. The pixels that were cropped away are still saved in that image file that is embedded into your document. And if you only have 1 or 2 pictures, this won't really be a problem. But when you have a really long document with multiple images in that have all been cropped in this manner, you end up bloating the document quite a bit with all this sort of extra data that doesn't really need to be there. And we all know that once these documents are near completion, they're very, very long. And so having this sort of bloating, this extra data floating around can contribute to lagging and syncing issues, and we want to avoid that as much as possible. So I would really recommend cropping your images in GIMP before pasting them into your documents if possible, just to reduce that sort of bloat and sort of all this extra data that just gets pumped into these documents that doesn't necessarily have to be there. So I've selected the crop tool, and now I'm going to, for this example, I'm going to be working with an image of a glacial lake in the Himalayas. And let's say we want to just show the lake. So I'm going to drag down and draw the shape, and I can make some fine adjustments with these sort of sliders on the frame of the shape. Then to crop the image, I simply click in the middle and it crops the image to what I've selected. I can zoom in and double check that everything's fine. If I'm not happy with it, I can say Control Z and then just try again. Make some fine adjustments and crop. There we go. Now you'll see the image is sort of resized completely to what I've selected, and all the other data has been sort of deleted. If you're a bit unsure about your cropping and you want to have a little bit more flexibility, you can deselect this option here on the tool options for the cropping tool where it says delete crop pixels. Deselect that and then make your cropping, and then you'll see there's this ghost outline frame around the cropped image, which represents the original image. So those pixels haven't been deleted. So this cropping functions similarly to the way cropping works in the Microsoft Office software. Then if you go to the move tool, you can sort of move the image around and make some sort of fine scale adjustments if you want. But as I said, I wouldn't recommend cropping in this fashion because it's not really necessary to have that data floating around. So I'm going to crop the image to the selected size, click in the middle, click in the middle, and there, the image is now cropped. So once you've made any edits to an image in GIMP, the next thing you need to do is export the image so that you can actually save your work. So if you go to the file drop down, you'll see all these save options here. You need to just be a bit careful because it can be habitual to sort of just say, okay, save. The problem is that with GIMP is that it has its own GIMP file format. And so when you save this, it saves it in that format. And then when you open that file, it sort of saves your progress and opens in this state. So you can do that if you're busy working on something and you're not finished. You can save it, and then you can carry on with your work later. You don't have to open it in GIMP and start all over again. But if you're done with something, what you need to do is actually export the image. So you can either overwrite the original image file, but I don't recommend doing this because it's always good to have a copy of the original image that you worked from in case you always need to go back to things. So what you need to do is export this as a new image. So when you go to export, this little export window will pop up, and then you can adjust the name of your file. So this will now be the cropped version of this image. To change the format that you export an image to in GIMP, you simply manually change the file extension. So at the moment, because the file extension is a JPEG file extension, it's going to export as a JPEG image. If I wanted to change this to a PNG, I simply change the extension to PNG. But because this is a photographic image, JPEG is going to be the best format for this. So I will change this to a JPEG extension and then click export. Then a little export secondary window is going to jump up where I can choose the quality, and there's a few other options. All these other options you can just leave at the default settings. The only thing you might be wanting to change is the quality. So obviously the quality slider lets you adjust the quality at which you export this image. The lower the quality of the image, the lower the file size. So you're only really going to adjust this when you're quite concerned about file size. As a general rule of thumb for JPEGs, if the image is looking pretty clear and you're only editing it once and you're wanting to bump the file size down a little bit, you can bump it down to 90% and it will bump the file size down a little bit, and the quality of the image will not be reduced in a particularly noticeable way. But for smaller images, you can leave this at 100% and it shouldn't make too much of a difference. You can then export the image, and if we go to our files, we can see the cropped version is here. Next, I'm going to go over scaling an image. The way I prefer to scale images is to go to the image tab at the top and then go to scale image down from this drop-down menu. And what this does is it gives you a little window that gives you very exact control over exactly how you would like to scale this image. You can change your unit of measurement from pixels to millimeters and various other options. And then what you can do is just simply change the width or height value of the image. So let's say, for example, we wanted to make this image a little bit smaller, and we wanted to make it 1500 pixels wide. I've now typed the new value in, and then if I click down here at the height, it will automatically adjust this because the ratio of width to height is maintained. And the reason that this is maintained is because this little chain link option is automatically selected. If I deselect it, then I could change these numbers independently and they won't automatically update. But this is not recommended because what you'll end up doing is stretching out your image. So it's better to adjust the one and then just automatically update the other. So let's make this one 100. There we go. So you can change this, but I really wouldn't recommend it. You're going to end up squishing your image, which is not ideal. The other settings you don't need to worry about. The resolution you can leave on the default settings that come with will be taken from the source image. And then the quality, the default should be cubic, and I usually leave it on cubic. That sort of algorithm for scaling tends to work really, really well. Then you click scale and your image will be scaled, and then you can view it at 100% to see the size of the image as you wanted it. Then, as before, you will export the image at its new size. So that's how you scale an image. Next, I'm going to go over some of the color adjustments for images. So if we go to this colors drop-down menu at the top here, there's going to be several options that we can work with to adjust the coloring of this image. For the most part, you won't need to use all of them. I'm just going to cover the ones that are sort of the most useful for making slight tweaks to an image. One that might come in handy is color temperature. So changing the color temperature sort of changes the sort of balance of reds and blues in an image. So you can make an image appear warmer or colder. So if we take this original temperature slider and we pump it up, you can see the image is getting quote unquote colder, and that means all the blues are starting to pop a bit more. The whites have a little bit of a blue tint to them. All the reds and browns are a little bit less sort of strong, a little bit less saturated. And if we push this to an extreme, the image will become quite blue. If we go in the other direction, then the image becomes warmer, and so your yellows and red tones tend to pop quite a bit more. And we push it all the way to the extreme, you can see all the whites get washed out as red. So depending on the state of the original image that you're working with, this can be quite a useful way to sort of adjust some minor visual elements of the image. Another one that's quite useful is the brightness and contrast. So brightness and contrast, obviously the brightness, if you bump that down, the image will darken, and if you bump it up, the image will lighten. The contrast sort of adjusts the level of difference between the color values of pixels. So if you bump contrast up really high, everything sort of shifts to an extreme. So your light colored pixels will shift closer to white, and your dark colored pixels will shift closer to black. And your colors will become extremely saturated. And if you bump it down, then you're losing contrast between things, and they all just fade into a gray blur. So this is quite a powerful way to sort of just adjust some sort of visual aspects of your image. So for this one, brightness is pretty high, or it's quite a bright image. There's a lot of white in that, so I'm not going to bump that up much. So I might just bump the contrast up by a few values. You can see I've only adjusted it by 8 points, and if I go split preview, you can sort of see on the left hand side the image just pops a little bit more. There's a very, very subtle change, and it won't be necessary to do on all your images. It might just depend on whether the photo was taken and the exposure settings were a little bit off, or if the image is just looking a little bit flat. This is a very quick little way to sort of adjust that. But obviously you need to be careful to not overdo it, because the minute you overdo contrast, the image starts looking quite artificial. So I've bumped it up just by 28 units, and you can see now that the left-hand side, you can see it's been edited, and it just doesn't look natural. But if we keep it within the realm of a few points, so like there, 10 points, the left-hand side just pops a little bit better. So that's also one way to just sort of tweak the visual aspects to make an image just look a little bit better. You can also adjust the hue and the saturation of an image. So adjusting the hue will basically cycle you through the entire color spectrum. So as I go through, you can see the colors are changing. And if I go back down to the bottom, it sort of goes in a full circle. So that's one that's really more of an artistic effect that you probably won't need to use much. The saturation obviously drives the color values up of a pixel. So as I'm driving this up, you can see all the colors are driving to a more extreme value. I've now set that at 100. These browns are almost completely orange. The sort of washed out blues are now strong, full blues. And so if the color in your image is a little bit washed out, you can always adjust the saturation. And again, it's best to only adjust this by a few points, because if you overdo it, the image can start looking very artificial. Another function that is quite useful is if you go to the exposure setting. So if you've got a photo that is slightly over or underexposed, you can sort of make these adjustments here. So it allows you to make these slight tweaks to the exposure just to sort of balance out any exposure issues that the original image might have had. And again, subtlety is sort of key here. You know, if we look on the left-hand side, just a few adjustments to exposure can make the image just look a little bit more vibrant than compared to the right-hand side. We don't want to go too extreme with this, otherwise it starts looking quite ridiculous. The rest of the features in the color menu are all ones that I don't think will really be applicable for sort of a work setting. I would recommend playing around with them in your own time and seeing what they do. It's a good way to learn about all these different functions. But for the needs of what we do on a day-to-day basis, I don't think any of the others will come into play. And these tend to be quite extreme changes. If you invert an image, you know, makes it look quite, it's more of a more artistic sort of function than anything we would need in our day-to-day work. Another thing that we can do to an image is we can go to the filters tab. Again, a lot of these are more artistic sort of functions, but if for some reason an image is a little bit unclear, what we can do is go to enhance, and then you can sort of sharpen an image with this sharpens, and then it's also known as the unsharp mask function. Now, sharpening is again something that needs to be used with caution, because if you overdo it, the image will start to look quite artificial. Now, this image that I'm using was already quite well defined, but you can sort of see how the sort of sharpening effect sort of can make the left-hand side just look a little bit clearer. Again, this can't perform miracles. If you have a very blurry image, this sort of algorithm can't completely fix that. It's more of a slight tweak that can just sort of slightly improve the visuals of your image. And that's going to end the basic sort of functionality section of these training videos.